War. War never changes.
Some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war. Welcome to episode 66, the Battle of Challons. Here's another battle with a ton of different names. The Battle of Catalonian Plains, Battle of Catalonian Fields, Battle of the Campus Mariacus, Battle of Challons, Battle of Troyes, or the Battle of Marica. Whichever, doesn't matter. The battle took place on June 20th, 451, so we think, between a coalition led by the Roman general Flavius Aetius and the Visigothic king Theodoric I against the Huns and their vassals, commanded by their very famous king Attila. Despite being noteworthy as the last great victory of the Roman Empire, the majority of the forces were actually Gothic German foederati. The foederati were those allied to Rome by treaty, as opposed to subjugated by military triumphs. Such had the power of Rome fallen. And arguably, the Battle of Challons was the least decisive of the 15 decisive battles. In fact, it wasn't even the decisive battle of the campaign. Rather, the failed siege of Cinnabon, also known by the Latin Aurelianum, which eventually evolved to the present-day Orleans. The siege was lifted by a combined force of Gauls and Germans and represented the culminating point of that particular Hunnic adventure. The Battle of Challons was more of a denouement to the Hunnic European tour, a last stand following a long retreat and pursuit. The most interesting aspect of the battle was the number of different tribes and nations involved. Famous and obscure names such as Goths, Vandals, Alans, Franks, and Burgundians all apparently took part, with some, notably the Franks and Burgundians, fighting on both sides. But the star of the show was the infamous and notorious Attila and his Huns. So, who were the Huns? Well, they were a short-lived empire lasting about 200 years and originating from Central Europe. Nomadic and horsebound like the later Mongols, they slowly pushed west, the farthest being, unsurprisingly, the territory now called Hungary. This name comes from the medieval Latin meaning land of the Huns, but it appears that the Huns themselves spent little time there, being closer to the Black Sea and Carpathian Mountains. As a side note, and as with so many other nations, those who live in Hungary are themselves Magyars, and refer to their own country as Magyarország, or Country of the Magyars. There is some evidence that the Huns and Mongols not only had similar lives, but share some genetics. Like the Mongols, the Huns relied on mounted archery as their primary fighting techniques, giving them high mobility, but little ability to hold territory. As such, the attack and retreat tactic being favored and the high mobility meant armies raised to counter them were incapable of coming to grips. The Hunnic pastoral lifestyle left little archaeological evidence, and nearly all we know of them is by legendary tales from their enemies, and little of it good. They were famous for their butchery and created much of the early Christian era history of suffering, which is why I suspect Attila and his Huns are remembered as much as they are for so brief a period of conflict. The Goths certainly were far more impactful on Europe and Rome in particular. The Huns are documented to have killed Christian victims, particularly during their invasions and raids. One account describes how Christian slaves taken by the Huns in 452 were forced to participate in Hunnic religious activities, including their subjugation and persecution. The Huns' actions were often framed within a Christian apocalyptic context, with Attila himself apparently proclaiming himself the scourge of God, sent to punish the Christianized Roman world for its sins, which contributed to the perception of the Huns as instruments of divine retribution. This belief system surely intensified the fear and suffering experienced by Christian populations under Hunnic control. Additionally, Christian hagiographic legends recount the martyrdom of Christian figures by the Huns, such as Saint Ursula and her 11,000 virgins, who were killed by the Huns near Cologne after refusing their advances, and the legend of Saint Servatius of Tongeren, who is said to have converted Attila and the Huns before they apostatized. These stories, while legendary, reflect the deep impact and fear the Huns instilled in Christian communities. It provides the foundation of the early Christian mythology of persecution, which is why the Huns, again, despite having a relatively short-lived reign of terror with little long-term cultural impact, remain so well known. And what of Attila? He first gained the throne jointly with his brother Bleda in 435 until Bleda's questionable death in 445, after which Attila ruled as king solely until his own death in 453, when his three sons divided the soon-to-be-dissolved empire among themselves. His birth date and place of death and burial are unknown. Even the location of the capital city of the Huns is unknown, as, befitting their pastoral culture, it may not have existed at all. He was described, secondhand, as short, broad, and vaguely Asiatic. Their language is only a guess, as they had no written records. All that we know is secondhand. The foremost fact of the times of Attila is the schism of Rome was well established, with the Eastern Roman Empire at Constantinople being completely separate from that of the Western Roman Empire, whose capital was now located in Ravenna, north of Rome. Rome having relinquished its role as capital of the empire back in 286 by the Emperor Diocletian, first to Mediolanum, and then, a century later, to Ravenna. It is worth noting that Diocletian abandoned the western part of the empire immediately after the move and took the throne at Nicomedia, formalizing the split between west and east. 45 years later, Constantine would move the eastern capital to Byzantium, astride the Straits of Bosphorus, and renamed that city Constantinople. The advances of the Huns from the east had pushed many tribes west, causing instability for both Rome and Constantinople. Due to proximity, it was the Eastern Empire who dealt the most with the Huns, paying tribute in tons of gold to avoid their wrath. Several times the Huns under Attila attempted to take Constantinople and failing, but never without squeezing more money from Theodosius II, whose reign in Constantinople lasted nearly 50 years. After his last extortion from the east and having been defeated in an eastern excursion in Iran, Attila struck the Germans to the north on a rampage throughout Germany, ironically following the Roman roads down to Gaul, where his attempt to take Orleans by siege failed. So he was already heading home with his Hunnic tail somewhat tucked when he decided to make an organized stand at Challons, mostly to maintain order and hopefully end any hopes at a prolonged pursuit. I did a lot of reading for this episode. For one, I've never studied this battle before, and frankly, the late Roman Empire period is a confusing mess, with Goths, Alans, Vandals, and dozens of other nationalities and tribes all wresting what they can from the dying Roman Empire. Never mind the fact that the empire itself was cut in two. And one thing that this battle reinforced is that no one knows what the hell actually happened. There are several different authors of the sources used, none of whom were present at the battle. And I'm not sure what is worse, several sources or one. We rely heavily on Thucydides for the Peloponnesian War, which means the narrative is simple and clear. But it could be, and almost certainly is, completely wrong. And to the greater point, who cares? Is historical inaccuracy of a battle 2,500 years ago of that much importance? Does it invalidate the lessons learned? Not necessarily. Even in my own book, written about a skirmish in which I participated with two separate video sources, I got a lot wrong. Watching video of myself contradicted my own memory less than 2 days old. I include this detour to simply note that during and after a battle, no one knows what is happening or what happened to any certitude. And the more inputs received, the more accurate the picture theoretically is, but when the information is directly contradictory, it is impossible to know what is correct and what is false. And what's worse is the perceived contradiction may simply be one of perspective and not of reality. In today's modern battlefield with several real-time sensors, we are tricked into believing that thousands of miles away from the battlefield, we have a better understanding of the battle than those who are there. And this is but a partial truth. Video feeds provide a very narrow point of focus. Some call it the soda straw. So who knows more, the man on the ground or the man looking through 5 different soda straws simultaneously? Both, I would say, depending. Returning to Clausewitz, but neglecting his fascinating trinity, we have the fog and friction of war. The more assets you dedicate to removing the fog of battle, you inherently introduce more friction. Every line of communication you open is another means by which the machine interacts and can grind itself down. Worse, if you become overly reliant upon one means, what happens if you lose that means? The permissive airspace assumed for drone warfare can be easily denied. Even in today's modern war in Ukraine, the drones are becoming less capable as countermeasures are created. Radio-controlled are being replaced with fiber optics, which themselves create their own vulnerabilities. Israel in Gaza has near complete observation capabilities and, yet, due to the tunnels used by Hamas and their lack of uniforms, still cannot conclude the conflict. All this to say, I speak with some level of unjustifiable certainty when discussing the various historical battles, fully cognizant of my reliance on completely untrustworthy sources. So with that, on to the actual battle. The three main parts of the Romans were the Visigoths on the right, who occupied Gaul, the Alans and German tribes on the left, and the Roman commander Flavius in the center, with scarcely a single Roman legionnaire to his credit. Even his command was made up of poorly trained auxiliaries. The total force for each side was about 50,000. For the Huns, their Hunnic forces occupied the center, a strange arrangement for a cavalry force, with the Ostrogoths allied against their western cousins, and the Huns' general allies likewise opposite their Roman allied cousins. The battle commenced late in the day due to the varied terrain, described as either a long ridge or plains with a hill on the Gothic side, and the former considered more likely, as well as the difficulty in arraying forces of several different languages, tribal affiliations, and varied motivations for the fight. Theodoric, leading the Visigoths, led the attack against the Ostrogoths, but he himself quickly fell. Whether by poor horsemanship or enemy missiles is unknown. The Visigoths were fighting in their own territory, which would explain their superior motivation. Neither the Alans, Roman auxiliaries, nor German tribes showed any distinct motivation. On the Hunnic side, the Huns themselves sought only to delay, and the Theodoric-less Goths soon forced the Huns back to the baggage train to establish a purely defensive position. For all the offensive strength of horse-mounted, arrow-launching light cavalry, this is precisely the type of battle such forces try to avoid. The Visigoths fighting on their home turf apparently alone showed any offensive spirit, but with the death of their leader, his son fled the battlefield immediately to solidify his claim on the now vacant throne. Attila and his allies were able to disengage, and no one was able to pursue. So why is this a decisive battle? Well, it isn't. Creasy got it wrong here. Attila was still able to retreat, as he was already doing, with his forces intact. His advance was stopped at the siege of Orleans. Attila invaded the west yet again the next year, going into Italy and the Po Valley, gaining tribute and retreating yet again. The Huns were defeated the next year by their former German allies at the Battle of Nadeo, and Attila died soon after, and with it, the unified Hunnic Empire and any threat to the west. The Huns had no culture worthy of emulation, which means their victories were short-lived economic wins, simply prolonged looting and pillaging tours of force, incapable of historical significance, save the long-remembered terror. Edward Gibbon and Creasy argued it was the last victory of the Western Roman Empire, but even that rings hollow, considering effectively no Romans took part in it. The key lessons reinforced is the criticality of effective alliances, the motivation of fighting on home turf, and that superior mobility gives you operational options while limiting your ability to wage a defensive effort against a fixed position. If you want to use mobility in the defense, you must be willing to sacrifice towns and cities to those for whom infantry and fires reign supreme. Thanks for listening today. If you want to help the show, please share today's episode on any social media sites you can. Check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for more information and to send me a message. And, of course, my thanks to the subscribers who help keep the show going. Hope you all join me next week. See you soon.